The sun was dipping below the horizon as I pulled my beloved Jeep onto the ranch driveway after a long day. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just me coming home, parking where I always did. The crunch of the gravel beneath the tires was a familiar sound, a small comfort after hours spent running the day-to-day operations as police chief and managing the sprawling property. But this day was different. As I locked the Jeep and headed toward the house, I noticed a flurry of activity near the main gate. The HOA's infamous Karen was standing there, arms crossed with that signature glare she reserved for anyone who dared displease her. She didn't even acknowledge my presence. Instead, she was busy on the phone. I didn't need to guess. Karen was reporting something to the cops. Again, apparently, my Jeep's parking spot, right in front of my own property, was a violation of some HOA rule that I had never been properly informed about. Karen insisted it was blocking access, or a safety hazard, even though there was at least 5 feet of clearance on either side, and no emergency vehicles had ever had an issue. What really set me off wasn't just the absurdity of the complaint, but the fact that Karen had called 911 over it, wasting police resources and embarrassing the community with her pettiness. She clearly didn't know who she was dealing with. When the officers arrived the moment they saw me in uniform and realized I was their chief, their expressions shifted from confusion to awkward respect. The whole situation suddenly felt surreal, a HOA dispute turning into an official police matter right at my front door. I calmly explained the facts, the property boundaries, and the legal limitations of HOA authority. I reminded Karen and the officers that while HOA rules exist to maintain order, they cannot override individual property rights or create their own version of the law. Most importantly, I stressed that no parking violation had occurred. Karen tried to push back, attempting to sway the officers with her version of community safety. But it was clear that without real evidence or legal backing, her complaints were baseless. This chapter marks the beginning of a long, drawn-out battle, one where HOA overreach met the law head-on, where a Jeep's simple parking spot ignited a firestorm of conflicts, legal arguments, and neighborhood tension, and where a police chief had to remind everyone that the badge isn't just for show, especially when it's your own front yard on the line. The day had barely begun when Karen dialed 911. It wasn't a typical emergency call, no fires, no medical crises, no crimes in progress. Instead, she reported a suspicious vehicle parked dangerously close to the community entrance. Her voice was sharp, filled with the kind of urgency usually reserved for real emergencies. But this was no emergency. It was a Jeep, my Jeep, parked where it always had been for years. When dispatch received the call, they sent 2 patrol officers to the scene. Given that I was the police chief and also the owner of the Jeep in question, I was quick to notify my command staff about the unfolding situation. This was a classic case of HOA overreach spiraling out of control, but with a unique twist. They had no idea who they were calling about. As the officers arrived, Karen was already there, waving her arms dramatically and explaining the danger of the parked vehicle. She painted a picture of a reckless neighbor endangering the community by blocking emergency access and creating hazards. I watched from a distance, amused but also concerned that her false narrative could cause real trouble. When the officers approached, their eyes scanned the area carefully. They measured the clearance between the Jeep and the driveway, spoke with a few neighbors, and examined the community's rules, or lack thereof, regarding parking on private property. There was no violation, no obstruction, no hazard. That's when I stepped in. Wearing my uniform and badge, I introduced myself calmly and professionally. Their demeanor shifted immediately. Here was the chief, on his own turf, handling what was essentially a frivolous complaint. I explained the legal boundaries between HOA authority and private property rights. While HOAs have the power to enforce community rules, they cannot supersede laws or infringe on individual property rights. Parking on my own driveway wasn't illegal. The HOA's parking guidelines were vague at best and certainly didn't prohibit what I was doing. Karen, however, was undeterred. She tried to insist the Jeep was a danger and that the neighborhood deserved better. But the officers weren't buying it. They were bound to the law, and the law was crystal clear. In the end, no citation was issued, and the officers left with polite but firm instructions to discourage future frivolous calls about non-issues. Karen was left standing there, fuming. That phone call was a turning point, showing just how far HOA paranoia could go and how quickly it could waste police resources. But it also marked the start of a bigger problem. Karen had no idea who she was messing with. The battle lines were drawn, and my Jeep was at the center of the storm. The moment the patrol cars pulled up to my property, I knew this was going to be an unusual scene. It's not every day that the police chief has the officers arriving at his own front gate because of a petty HOA complaint about a parked Jeep. But this was exactly what happened. I stepped outside in my uniform, calm but alert. The officers got out, looking a bit uncertain. Their body language said, "What's going on here?" And then they saw me, the badge, the patch, the unmistakable presence of the department's head. Suddenly, the dynamics shifted entirely. I greeted them with a nod, keeping things professional. "Glad you're here," I said. "Let's clear this up." They explained they were called by the HOA, specifically Karen, reporting a suspicious vehicle blocking access. I chuckled inwardly. Suspicious? It was my Jeep. Parked in my driveway. That was about as ordinary as it got. We walked around the Jeep together, inspecting the space. I pointed out the clear access on either side, the fact that emergency vehicles had never had trouble, and the absence of any official no parking signs. The officers took notes, exchanged glances, and listened as I outlined the relevant property laws and HOA regulations. Karen, still standing nearby with a defiant glare, attempted to interject several times. But I held the floor, calmly refuting her claims point by point, using facts instead of emotion. The officers appreciated the clarity. They understood that while HOA disputes often looked serious on the surface, many were just misunderstandings, or worse, petty power plays. Before leaving, one of the officers said quietly, "It's good to have the chief on your side for this kind of thing." It wasn't a joke. It was genuine respect for the legal knowledge and calm demeanor I brought to the situation. Karen's face tightened with frustration. This wasn't the outcome she wanted. She had called the cops to intimidate. But instead, she found herself outmatched by someone who not only knew the law but enforced it every day. That day, I realized something important. Being a police chief wasn't just about enforcing laws on the streets. It was about protecting my own rights and standing up when those rights were challenged, even in my own backyard. This was only the beginning. The arrival of the cops didn't end the battle. It escalated it. Karen's calls would continue, her tactics would grow bolder, and I'd have to prepare for the fight ahead. But one thing was certain. She had underestimated me, and that mistake would cost her. One of the biggest problems with Karen's complaint was her insistence that I was violating the HOA's parking rules. That sounded straightforward at first. After all, homeowners associations are supposed to have clear guidelines to keep the neighborhood orderly, right? But as I dug deeper, it became painfully obvious that the HOA's parking rules were anything but clear. The HOA's governing documents included a few vague clauses about parking. The language was full of terms like reasonable restrictions and community aesthetics, but it lacked any concrete specifics about exactly where residents could or couldn't park their personal vehicles on their own property. This vagueness was a perfect breeding ground for arbitrary enforcement. especially by people like Karen, who seemed determined to interpret the rules in whatever way suited her agenda. When I requested a copy of the HOA's official parking policy, the response was slow and incomplete. Karen and her allies selectively quoted parts of the bylaws that could be twisted to support their position but refused to provide a definitive rulebook or clarify the parameters of acceptable parking. In meetings, Karen regularly cited supposed violations as justification for her actions, whether it was about my Jeep, my neighbor's vehicles, or even temporary guest parking. Her enforcement was unpredictable, inconsistent, and clearly biased against anyone who challenged her. The inconsistency extended to how the board dealt with other residents. Some neighbors parked in ways that were arguably more obstructive, but were ignored, presumably because they were on Karen's good side or simply more compliant. Meanwhile, Karen's selective scrutiny was a source of anxiety for anyone who valued their independence. This arbitrary enforcement was a form of power play, not community stewardship. It created confusion, resentment, and a toxic atmosphere in a place that should have been peaceful. What made it worse was Karen's tendency to conflate HOA rules with legal authority. She acted as if her word was law, forgetting that an HOA's reach is limited by state statutes and homeowners' rights. As police chief, I knew the boundaries. An HOA can impose rules related to shared spaces and common areas, but cannot override private property rights or law enforcement authority. My Jeep was parked on my property, not a public street or HOA-owned lot. Unless the HOA had passed and recorded a clear, lawful restriction, which they hadn't, there was no legitimate basis for Karen's complaints. Understanding the arbitrary nature of these rules and Karen's willful misapplication of them was key. It wasn't just about one vehicle or one parking spot. It was about the broader struggle to protect individual rights against unchecked HOA power. That realization shaped how I approached the rest of the conflict. I knew I had to be not only firm but also strategic, exposing the inconsistencies, demanding transparency, and rallying the community to stand up against abuse disguised as rule enforcement. After sorting through the HOA's vague parking policies and Karen's ongoing accusations, it became clear that standing my ground required more than just facts. It required education and authority. I had to explain, not only to Karen, but to the entire HOA board and the community what property rights really meant and how police authority fit into this tangled web. First, I called a meeting, not as the police chief but as a homeowner, to clarify the legal boundaries. I prepared a detailed presentation outlining the limits of HOA power, the rights of property owners, and the role of law enforcement in resolving disputes. I emphasized that the HOA's authority was limited to managing common areas and enforcing rules within the framework of state laws and the HOA's own bylaws. Importantly, those bylaws could not infringe on private property rights without explicit, legally binding provisions. I explained that parking on one's own driveway is a fundamental right, protected by both property law and state statutes. Then I turned to my law enforcement expertise. I explained that while police officers respond to complaints, they are bound by law and cannot enforce HOA rules that violate legal property rights. I reiterated that frivolous or unfounded complaints not only waste police resources but also erode community trust. To reinforce the message, I shared examples from past cases where courts sided with homeowners over overreaching HOA boards. I made it clear that if Karen or the HOA continued with baseless complaints or attempts to restrict my rights, legal action could and would be pursued. Karen tried to interrupt and dismiss my points as lawyer talk, but the community was listening. Many neighbors had grown frustrated with vague rules and Karen's selective enforcement. They appreciated having clear, factual information from someone who knew both sides of the law. Standing firm with facts and authority helped shift the balance. Karen's power trip lost some steam, but she was far from finished. She still tried to push boundaries, but now the HOA board and neighbors had a clearer understanding of what was and wasn't permissible. This chapter was a turning point, where knowledge became the real power. It wasn't about yelling or threats. It was about calmly, confidently asserting rights backed by law and experience. And sometimes, that's all it takes to make bullies back down. Just when I thought the matter might settle down after clarifying the rules and my rights, Karen decided to escalate the situation. It became clear that her initial complaints about my Jeep were just the opening salvo in a broader campaign to undermine me and exert control over my property. This was no longer about parking, it was personal. Within days of my meeting with the HOA and neighbors, I started noticing signs of retaliation. Notices appeared taped to my gate, filled with vague threats about violations and community standards. Letters demanding compliance with arbitrary rules were slipped under my door, often with misspelled legal jargon and misquoted bylaws. Karen spearheaded the effort, rallying a small group of HOA members who seemed eager to enforce her vision, regardless of legality. She escalated to filing formal complaints against me for things that were simply not true. Claims about noise disturbances, unauthorized landscaping changes, and even unsubstantiated accusations that I was using my property for commercial activities. Each complaint triggered a round of unnecessary inspections and communications from the HOA's management company. Karen's tactics were clearly meant to intimidate and wear me down, but I refused to back down. As police chief, I was no stranger to dealing with harassment or baseless accusations, and I applied the same steady resolve here. I documented every interaction, every complaint, and every notice. I knew that keeping a clear record would be crucial if this battle escalated into legal action. The community began to see the pattern too. Some neighbors approached me privately, expressing their frustration with Karen's heavy-handed approach. Many admitted they had felt powerless against the HOA's whims and were grateful someone was finally standing up to the abuse. However, Karen didn't stop. She started showing up at community meetings, loudly challenging me in front of others, trying to paint me as a lawbreaker and troublemaker. Her attempts to publicly shame me were clumsy but relentless. It was a bitter irony. Karen called the cops on my Jeep, only to find herself repeatedly on the receiving end of police and legal scrutiny as her actions crossed the line into harassment and possible violations of civil rights. This chapter marked the shift from a simple dispute into an all-out power struggle. Karen's retaliation made clear she wasn't just enforcing HOA rules, she was waging a personal vendetta. But as a police chief, I was ready. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about protecting the principles of justice and fairness against unchecked authority. Karen's retaliation didn't just involve words and letters. It soon escalated into actions that crossed the line. To protect myself and document what was happening, I decided to ramp up security on my ranch. I installed cameras strategically around my property, especially near the gate, driveway, and areas where Karen and her cronies had been lurking. Almost immediately, the footage revealed troubling behavior. There were instances of Karen approaching my property late at night, fiddling with my gate lock, and even attempting to take photos or videos without my permission. On several occasions, she appeared to be encouraging other HOA members to trespass or provoke me. With these recordings in hand, I started building a solid case, not only for protecting my property rights, but also for defending myself against false complaints. Karen had continued to flood the HOA board and even the local authorities with exaggerated and sometimes outright false claims. Each complaint triggered unnecessary investigations, wasting time and resources. I also began gathering witness statements from neighbors who had observed Karen's behavior firsthand. Many were hesitant at first, afraid of retaliation or social backlash. But once they saw I was serious about holding Karen accountable, several stepped forward. Their testimonies corroborated the footage and helped paint a clear picture of harassment and misuse of HOA power. Having solid evidence was empowering. It meant I wasn't just fighting with words or relying on my position as police chief. I had facts on my side, clear proof of the HOA's overreach and Karen's personal vendetta. When confronted with this evidence, the HOA board found themselves in a difficult position. Some members who had blindly supported Karen began questioning the wisdom of continuing her campaign against me. Others worried about legal liability if things escalated further. But Karen was undeterred. Her attempts to block or discredit the evidence only made her look more suspicious. The escalating tension turned the community into a powder keg, with residents divided between supporting me and backing the HOA leadership. By this point, the dispute was no longer just about parking a Jeep. It had evolved into a complex legal and social conflict involving property rights, community governance, and personal vendettas. The security footage, witness accounts, and documented false complaints would ultimately prove essential in bringing clarity and justice to the situation. With tensions escalating and Karen's relentless attacks showing no sign of stopping, I realized the situation had moved beyond HOA meetings and informal disputes. It was time to take the next step, seeking legal counsel to protect my rights and prepare for the inevitable court battles. I contacted a trusted attorney who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. During our first meeting, I laid out the entire saga, from the initial parking complaint to the harassment, false accusations, and misuse of HOA authority. My lawyer was unsurprised. Unfortunately, stories like mine were becoming more common as HOAs increasingly tested the limits of their power. The attorney helped me understand the legal framework governing HOAs, emphasizing that while these organizations have the right to enforce certain rules, they must do so within the boundaries of state law and cannot infringe on constitutional rights or private property protections. Together, we mapped out a legal strategy that included demanding the HOA halt all unwarranted enforcement actions against me, citing their lack of legal authority over my property, filing a formal complaint for harassment and abuse of power if Karen and the HOA continued their campaign, seeking injunctions or restraining orders if Karen's behavior crossed into trespassing or harassment, preparing for potential litigation to clarify property rights and prevent further HOA overreach. We also discussed the potential risks. Prolonged legal battles could strain community relationships and consume time and resources, but protecting my rights and setting a precedent against abusive HOA behavior was worth the fight. As police chief, I was no stranger to legal proceedings and the patience and precision they required. I knew the importance of building a rock-solid case, documenting everything meticulously, and maintaining professionalism throughout. The attorney advised me to keep communication with the HOA board and Karen limited and strictly factual, avoiding emotional confrontations that could be used against me later. With the legal groundwork laid, I felt prepared for the battles ahead. The gloves were off. This was no longer just about neighborhood disputes, but a fundamental fight for justice, respect, and the rule of law. As the legal battle with the HOA intensified, the community's reaction was a mixed bag. Some neighbors rallied behind me, appreciating my stand against what they saw as overreach and bullying. Others sided with Karen, either out of loyalty, fear, or frustration with the disruptions the conflict caused. My supporters admired the way I combined my role as a police chief with my position as a homeowner, using my knowledge and resources to defend not just my own rights, but potentially the rights of every resident in the neighborhood. Quiet conversations over backyard fences and community events often turn to discussions about HOA transparency, fairness, and accountability. Yet, on the other side, Karen and her allies portrayed me as a disruptive force, someone using his authority to intimidate and undermine community cohesion. They argued that the HOA was merely trying to uphold neighborhood standards and that my defiance threatened the peace. The split became evident at HOA meetings, where discussions were charged with tension. Some board members found themselves caught between supporting Karen's aggressive tactics and acknowledging the legal risks they faced. A few began to advocate for mediation and de-escalation, hoping to avoid costly court proceedings. Throughout, I remained focused on the bigger picture, fostering a community where rules are applied fairly, rights are respected, and disputes are resolved with dignity. I encouraged open dialogue, invited neighbors to ask questions, and shared information to demystify the legal complexities. Despite the challenges, this conflict sparked important conversations in the neighborhood about the limits of HOA authority, the importance of due process, and the need for transparency. Some residents who had previously felt powerless began to see the possibility of standing up for themselves. Of course, tensions remained high. Karen's faction continued to resist, determined to maintain control. But the community's shifting loyalties hinted that change was on the horizon. This chapter showed that battles like mine aren't just about rules and property. They're about people, trust, and the social fabric that holds neighborhoods together. The way those bonds hold or fray can determine whether conflicts escalate or resolve. After months of tension, legal preparation, and community debate, the situation with the HOA finally reached a turning point. Karen's baseless complaints and overreach were formally challenged, and the HOA board, facing mounting evidence and legal advice, began to back down. The pressure of potential lawsuits and the clear documentation of harassment made it impossible for them to continue their campaign without serious consequences. A mediated settlement was reached that reaffirmed my property rights and limited the HOA's ability to impose arbitrary restrictions. The HOA agreed to clarify their rules, improve transparency, and cease enforcement actions based on vague or selectively applied policies. Karen was warned formally about harassment and the legal implications of her actions. For me, the victory wasn't just about winning this battle. It was about setting boundaries, asserting the rule of law, and protecting not only my rights but the rights of all homeowners in the community. The experience reinforced that even in small neighborhood disputes, knowledge, preparation, and calm determination are powerful tools. Reflecting on the ordeal, several lessons stood out. Know your rights. Understanding property law and HOA regulations is crucial in defending against overreach. Document everything. Detailed records and evidence can make or break a case. Stay calm and professional. Emotional reactions can undermine your position and be used against you. Use legal resources wisely. Consulting experts early can prevent escalation and prepare you for all outcomes. Build community support. Allies strengthen your position and help foster positive change. Hold HOAs accountable. Organizations must operate within legal limits and respect homeowners' rights. Be prepared for resistance. Standing up against entrenched power often invites retaliation. Patience is key. Legal and social battles take time, but persistence pays off. Balance roles carefully. As police chief and homeowner, I had to separate professional duties from personal interests. Protect the bigger picture. Fights like these impact community health and justice beyond individual cases. In the end, Karen's attempts to intimidate and control failed because I refused to be bullied and armed myself with knowledge, authority, and resolve. The ranch returned to peace. My Jeep remained parked where it belonged, and the community gained a clearer understanding of fairness and respect. This chapter marks not just the end of a personal conflict, but the beginning of a stronger, more informed neighborhood, one where rights are protected and voices are heard.